Hello, good morning, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, from me, Yuri Bender, and everybody at the Financial Times here in London. I'm delighted to see so many of you around the world tuning in to our 2020 Wealth Management Summit. And I would like to thank our sponsors, NiCredit, Royal London Asset Management, Moxtra, and the Charities Aid Foundation for making this virtual event possible. Now, we've decided to split the running order today into two chunks, with business and industry matters addressed in the morning and investment themes in the afternoon. But of course, the interconnected issues of the US presidential election, the shift of global power to Asia, the concurrent COVID-19 pandemic, which is accelerating digital transformation, and the parallel social revolution and its demands for diversity, environmental standards, and justice will be underlying all of our discussions. I encourage as many of you as possible to ask questions throughout the day, and we'll be asking them whenever time permits. Please type them in the appropriate box on your screens. If you'd like to tweet or reference today's event, please use the hashtag FT Wealth Summit with wealth, the W and the S capitalized. Feedback forms will be emailed out after the event, so do let us know your thoughts. So this morning alone, we have a star-studded cast, including Peter Flavel, CEO of Coutts, allegedly Her Majesty the Queen's favorite bank, Jonathan Larson, Head of Innovation at Chinese insurance company Ping An, Dr. Kelly Keogh, Head of Digital Business at JP Morgan, and the professor himself, of course, Amin Rajan. But the first of my duties this morning is to invite our opening keynote speaker to the virtual stage. He'll be addressing how the global map of wealth and economic power is being redrawn. Now, I had the pleasure to meet this gentleman in Singapore, where he lives with his family several years back. He's a political and business philosopher, an academic and best-selling author, mapping out key trends in global power distribution, the building of mega cities, digital and innovation. His books include Connectivity and this volume, The Future is Asian, which I'm currently reading and would recommend to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so lucky to have him address us this morning on a historic day during a groundbreaking era. Let us welcome the managing partner of Future Map, Parag Khanna. Parag, the screen is yours.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I think everyone can be forgiven if your attention is somewhat divided. That said, irrespective of whatever happens in this US presidential election, the world map of power and wealth does continue to be redistributed, perhaps faster than anyone would have thought. Yuri, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I'm delighted to be with all of you today. And I'd love to dive right into the presentation, if we can bring up the slides, so that we can also have plenty of time for Q&A. So let's begin just by pointing out that one of the bright spots, if you will, to the extent that one can even use a term like that in the context of this global pandemic, is that there has been a growing appreciation for the good governance, for the success of Asia's, let's call them technocratic democracies, countries like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, as well as the authoritarian countries, Vietnam and China, that managed to suppress the pandemic. But rarely have people prior to this really appreciated that you can combine transparent, democratic governance, as these Pacific Rim Asian democracies do, with a very strong civil service, high degree of public trust in government, and an effective public services delivery the way they have. And I think that is going to be a lasting lesson. And indeed, more broadly, let's talk about how, given that the world economy has been set into such a tailspin, depression in many regions of the world, coming out of this, it is really only Asia that looks to be a bright spot, particularly led by China. Now, what's interesting there is that prior to this moment, we have described countries that have too much of their trade dependence hitched to China as being quote unquote Sino-dependent. It was described as something of a curse. But right now, at least temporarily, it is something of a blessing, given that export between or trade between Asian countries is rising. China is helping to drive the region forward. Now, let's remember one of the reasons why this is so important to focus on Asia when we talk about the shift of wealth and power. We are talking about more than 50% of the human population that is in Asia. And furthermore, that's not just a statistic for today. That is going to be true for the rest of our lives, our children's lives, and our grandchildren's lives. Many of you may or may not have seen some of the recent demographic research that is pointing to the fact that the world population is now likely to plateau by the year somewhere between 2040 and 2045. So we are reaching what I call peak humanity. In fact, the generation Alpha, which is today's children and those still to be born until the year 2025, is likely to be smaller or not reach the same size as Generation Z, today's preteens and early teens. That is really remarkable. We are at the kind of demographic inflection point that happens very rarely in history, but does tend to coincide with events like a pandemic. So you have a plateauing of the world population, but you have Asia as the demographic center of gravity, and you have the majority of the world's economic growth being generated in Asia. Therefore, it's very important to hone in on the activity inside this circle and understand what's going on. Now, let me talk about how wealth moves with people. We are, again, at a time of a pandemic where migration has been heavily restricted. In fact, never in human history have we had such a coordinated global border closure and lockdown. It has disrupted what have been the traditional migration patterns, which have been largely regional, and that is going to be enforced as a result of the pandemic, potentially even after we have a vaccine, given economic supply and demand issues in labor markets. So the majority of human migration is actually within Eurasia, and it's largely the populations of the former Soviet Union moving around, populations within Western Europe, to some degree, certainly populations between South Asia and the Gulf, but some of that has been reversed as well because of the pandemic and low oil prices. So the majority of human migration is not really south to north per se. It's within the north, and particularly in this greater Asian or Eurasian space. Keep that in mind when we think about where the growth markets of the future are going to be. Now, in Asia, one of the important things is that as we think about a world that is more regional than global, at least for the foreseeable future, Asia's advantage is that in having to a greater degree than other areas overcome the pandemic, this will reinforce the intra-regional, the internal Asian migration patterns. This can be students, it can be tourists, it can be business travelers. Already Asians traveled more within Asia than outside of Asia. Think about what's going to happen with tourism and students. We've already seen, of course, with China retaining much of its outbound population that would traditionally go abroad during certain holidays, that has actually really helped to buttress China's domestic services economy. Now, as you get the travel bubbles in Asia as well, you'll have that helping to restore economic growth. That's certainly why Asians are moving very quickly around these travel bubbles, green lanes, immunity certifications, airport testing, and of course, eventually vaccine deployment. China has just announced that it would like to portray its vaccine trials and eventually a delivery around the world as a global public good, so to speak. But be that as it may, it's going to be some time before there is a demand or a supply, really, for the volumes of trans-regional, intercontinental travel the way they were before. So when you think about regions that have that population density where cross-border movement is going to be restored quickly, that's another advantage that Asia has. Let's talk about demographics. When we think about the relationship between wealth and the transfer of wealth, of course, intergenerational transfer matters a great deal. Of course, it's coming up in the news right now when we look at the US election. If the Democrats raise taxes, we see what maneuvers wealthy people are already making. The same is happening in Europe and in specific Asian countries in terms of shifting assets into children's or grandchildren's name and other kinds of financial instruments and devices. So the intergenerational wealth transfer that represents the majority of the wealth that baby boomers are passing on to millennials and younger generations is underway right now, really from the 2010s through the 2030s is going to be this period. So thinking about where young people go and where young people are and who is inheriting wealth and what they do with it are very critical questions that we need to ask and to answer when we think about the future of consumption and investment by households and individuals. And Asia is looking quite strong in this area. And I show this slide because many people think of Asia as just old and aging, especially because they think about Japan, Korea, and coastal China and so forth. But remember that Asia also has plenty of young people when we're talking about nearly 5 billion people. Those two spikes on your left-hand side there are China and India, each of which has more young people, meaning people below its median age as a country, than all of Europe has people. Right? So we have to be careful when we describe China as just old and aging. No doubt it has a rising dependency ratio. That is true. But it still has, again, a very substantial number of young people who are upwardly mobile, earning, and so forth. India has, again, similar number of young people, but if you notice the light gray bars, it has a much younger median age. So one short item to flag is the Indian diaspora is actually only half the size of the Chinese diaspora in terms of international footprint, but most of the Chinese diaspora is within Asia, whereas the Indian diaspora is not only going to grow larger than the Chinese diaspora in the coming generation because of the youth factor, but it's also going to be much more international as a result of the English language and, of course, some of the geopolitical dynamics and suspicions that afflict Chinese people. So for those of you that work with Chinese families and businesses and so forth, you should be taking some of these things into consideration, and obviously the global mobility of Indians across a range of sectors. So there's a lot more to say about that. Let's move on to looking again at the regional picture. I just want to make a couple of points here on the global economy. There's a lot here, and of course, you're more than welcome to have these slides. But the point I want to make is that we are entering a phase of continental drift, as I call it. You have a North American economic and geopolitical system in many ways. The same is true of Europe and increasingly Asia. So we have a tripolar, tri-regional global economy. These regions are drifting in many ways from each other, not just because of the pandemic, as I highlighted earlier, but much more as a result of trends over the last 10 years that relate to industrial nearshoring, trade protectionism, financial protectionism, nationalism, and so forth. So really, these patterns have been underway, and I think that they are going to be an abiding feature of the global economic landscape. So for North America, you see that the U.S. trades more with Canada, trades more with Mexico than it does with China. Clearly, the U.S.-China trade relationship is not the central axis of global trade, not by a long shot, and I'll show you in just a moment which one is. Europe, moving into the fiscal union 20 years on from the monetary union, is a very positive step, one that has emerged or been accelerated as a result of crisis, and it's quite positive. The multi-trillion-dollar Eurozone budget that's been put forward will really help to shore up Southern Europe, for example, and the liquidity that's being created in the Euro sovereign bond market is actually going to be a very important, not only hedge, but diversification instrument for all of those central banks and others that are looking to move away from only holding US dollars at a time when the US dollar is set to perhaps gradually lose value and where trade with the United States may be declining for major countries. That would primarily be as a result of Asia trading more internally and trading more with Europe. So if you look at Asia's internal trade, it too is 60% of its total, which is a very important resilience mechanism for Asian economies. If you think about the results of the impact of the 98 financial crisis, the GFC of 2008, both of those instances over the last 20 years, Asian countries learned that they have to really double down on regionalism, on being their own buyer of last resort, if you will. This has taken numerous forms. In terms of Belt and Road, China has been reducing tariffs on all Belt and Road countries, largely focused on Asian markets. This is the only region where there is a major trade agreement being negotiated right now, the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So you have a lot of potential. Now, just a final point on this. When you think about the global economy right now and the recovery that we're hoping to have that is being driven forward, stimulus measures and liquidity being provided by central banks, it still will not be like the 2009-2010 period. That was a synchronized global recovery in which major economies, the G20, coordinated to try to restore global trade supply chain linkages. What's happening now is an asynchronous recovery in which countries and regions are focused primarily on shoring up their own industrial base and nearshoring supply chains. So you'll have the asynchronicity and focus on the local. And that, of course, applies very much even if Joe Biden wins the election in the United States. Let me jump ahead, as I already mentioned, RCEP. Let me talk about what's happening in the corporate world. Asia's growth is not only on the back of the, or its corporate foundations, not only on the sort of legacy or accomplishments of Japan Inc. and Korea Inc. and now China Inc. with some of the largest companies in the world being Chinese banks and technology firms, industrial firms, and so forth. But let's remember what comes next. What China is trying to do with its capital account liberalization is to draw in trillions of dollars of global financing. And it's important to remember that this is one of the areas that bucks the trend of regionalism, right? As China opens its capital account and that volume of capital now goes into Chinese equities, corporate debt, equity, and so forth, clearly that is not anti-globalization, right? It is a significant shot in the arm in terms of increased global capital flows. Now, what China is doing is, of course, what Japan and Korea have already done. And what Japan and Korea and China do, you can also expect the next wave of Asian growth markets to try to follow. So I foresee, especially at times of capital constraints and rising cost of capital, as you can imagine, emerging markets in Asia face, there is going to be significant pressures on privatization to bring that portfolio capital back in that's been lost over the past year. So I foresee quite a bit of quite a few measures being undertaken by governments from India through the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, you name it, really across Asia, to privatize state-owned companies, float certain assets, and so on. And that's, of course, an attempt again to lure in more foreign capital. That's why private equity has been building its war chests out here in Asia, I think, and sovereign wealth funds looking as well at the opportunities, because that is almost an inevitable consequence of this pandemic. Let me jump ahead and just spotlight the next wave of Asian opportunities. What I've put up thus far, the three dominant waves of Asian economic growth over the past 75 years. Wave one being, of course, Japan. Wave two, the tiger economies. Wave three being China itself, which brings us to the present. And the fourth wave is South and Southeast Asia. And I just want to underscore that here we're talking about 2.5 billion people from Pakistan through India, through the ASEAN economies such as Indonesia and the Philippines. 2.5 billion people. And as I mentioned earlier, not only India, but every single of them has a younger median age than China, with the lone exception of Thailand, that's aging at around the same pace as China. So you have young populations, rapid urbanization, and so forth. But again, 2.5 billion people. And in the pre-pandemic sort of period through 2019, growth rates were on average, somewhere between 4 and 6% across the region, which is quite impressive. It's going to take some time to get back to those levels. It's certainly going to take longer in India, where the pandemic is still hitting very hard, than in other regions. But let's bear in mind that ASEAN, up until 2019 or through the year 2019, was really catching up to China in terms of FDI. Now think about that for a minute. ASEAN is just about 700 million people, so half the population of China, half the population of India, but has a larger GDP than India, and has been receiving as much foreign investment as China. Hence, it is, some say, the new factory floor of the world. So I think that, focusing on Southeast Asia is a smart play at this point. Another reason is that, again, they're taking advantage of the supply chain shifts. It has to do with wage arbitrage. Japan really began to shift its supply chain activities out of China into Southeast Asia almost 10 years ago. So way before Donald Trump was elected, way before the trade war, and it proved to be a smart move. They have, had first mover advantage in places like Thailand, Vietnam for sure, Indonesia, India. What I'm showing you here is that this is a kind of a recurrent pattern when we think about economic development from a regional standpoint. standpoint. In the upper right, you see the older, wealthier, more sophisticated economies of Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. And as they age, what they tend to do is to look for younger, poorer, lower labor cost, but growing markets of those fourth wave economies that I mentioned earlier, South and Southeast Asia, to invest in and to outsource from and or outsource to. And there you see them clustered in the middle: India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and so forth. So the old, rich, and sophisticated invest heavily in the developing, poor, lower wage economies. And this is kind of how Eastern Europe became Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europe of the 1990s, that was not the driver in some ways of Eurozone growth today. It happened because Western European countries picked their sort of favorite Eastern European countries to begin to invest in and outsource to. That same phenomenon is now happening in Asia, and it's accelerated by the fact that each of these countries also has their own industrial policies. They're not just passively absorbing FDI, they're actively using some of the same policy measures that China undertook, using special economic zones, requiring having joint venture requirements and so forth, so that their workers get upskilled, technology gets transferred, their own firms become champions in their economies. And I think that's a positive step. Now, let's also remember that one of the important things that is a positive sort of growth driver and a sign of momentum is that though Southeast Asia has become a new factory floor of the world, it does not depend on manufacturing labor nearly as much as those economies did one generation ago. What I'm showing you here is that the majority of Asian economies are majority services driven. So even though they are on a per capita level far poorer than Western economies or societies, they still have a similar economic structure. Services, meaning young people moving into cities, working in education, healthcare, construction, hospitality, digital, telecoms, finance, you name it. That is actually the majority of what comprises the labor force and the economy in many of these countries, even though they also are getting most of the new marginal manufacturing work as well. So the keywords to remember here are urbanization, digitization, and also I would add financialization, because you are seeing a lot more of the technology role, mobile finance, mobile banking, through broadband internet penetration, and the cooperation that's taking place between banks and telcos right now. So this is as close as you get to leapfrogging, really. And again, as I mentioned, one of the key illustrations of this is the rise of national champions or regional champions here. Now, many people talk about how China and India are carving up Southeast Asia into a kind of new Cold War kind of technological duopoly. But here in this region, you see a very different picture. You see companies taking Japanese financing, Chinese financing, so SoftBank, Tencent, Alibaba, as well as Amazon, Google, and using that again to build up their national champions rather than succumb to be technological pawns, if you will. And I think that's a very positive story. So using finance, using technology, using trade agreements, using industrial policy to rapidly move up the value chain, and having, of course, more pragmatic governments. Let me jump over couple of points. I want to pan back to this big picture of Asia. Let's remember that in this rectangle, you have about 5 billion people. You have a huge amount of infrastructure investment that was really kicked off in the 90s by Europe and Japan. And now China's Belt and Road has emerged as a major contributor and a leader in that space around cross-border infrastructure finance. Where you see new infrastructure, and what I'm showing you here, pipelines, railways, internet cables, electricity grids, and so forth, where you see those sort of laid down and converge, that's where people will be migrating to. That's where you're going to see new job creation. That's where countries are taking in investment to diversify their economies, to grow, to ideally pay down their debts, especially debts to China, and to draw in fresh foreign investment. So you can see the growth in European companies in particular as they expand their presence in Central Asia, meaning the former Soviet republics, in everything from automotive or auto parts, food processing, and so forth, as well as in Southeast Asia, in a wide range of industries. So there is a virtuous cycle going on, even though there are specific cases of A, geopolitical tensions, B, debt traps. But by and large, large, the story is a positive one. And again, it tracks very much to history in terms of using infrastructure as a platform to create jobs for much larger populations than when these countries initially became independent from their colonial status decades ago. So I'm generally in favor of not only cross-border infrastructure finance, but the competition in that space, because it isn't just dominated by China. What's happening right now, for example, is that we actually have what I call an infrastructure arms race underway, in which you have Western powers. Let me jump ahead so you can hear. Western powers are waking up to what they fear as the China threat and responding by coming up with their own competitive initiatives. So you have the Quad alliance militarily. The US Secretary of State was just in India to cement something of a defense pact, but that's just two members of what is also this Quad that includes Australia and Japan. So these four countries are not only coordinating their military activities, but are also working on a range of schemes together, also with the European Union, to be competitive players in financing infrastructure development, bringing those lending rates down to concessional levels for poorer countries. But also, I would highlight here the bullet point around the resilient supply chain initiative. Pulling supply chains out of China in sensitive critical areas like semiconductors, telecoms, pharmaceuticals, auto parts, it really does benefit Southeast Asia more than any other region, because these are countries that have not alliances per se, but certainly strong positive relations with the United States and Europe. So I think that this, again, competitive connectivity, as I call it, or this infrastructure arms race with wide participation from Western liberal powers is going to ensure multipolarity across Asia rather than Chinese hegemony, and B, bring a whole lot of economic clusters, diversify them, distribute them out of just China alone, and shift the situation from what we think of today as a kind of linear pathway towards Chinese monopoly in certain areas into a very vibrant marketplace. And I think that's a positive thing. I just want to go back and highlight 2 points really quickly. One is that, as I was saying earlier, the bright spot, if you will, or the new dyad or most significant axis of global trade is Eurasian. It is between Europe and Asia. You can see the $1.6 trillion. That's, of course, now dated, but it is more trade between any two regions of the world with a lot more room to grow, because you can see how, whereas the United States did not join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and of course the Biden administration would not either, Europe now has an FTA with Japan, is seeking one with Vietnam now as well, is seeking one with ASEAN in general, certainly wants to enhance ties with India, and is pushing very hard for reciprocal market access to China. So Europe is very, very focused on increasing that number from 1.6 trillion. It becomes 2 trillion. Certainly, for the foreseeable future, this is going to be the axis of global trade. So you really, again, this reinforces my thesis of this sort of continental drift, a world in which North America is more and more autarkic, and Eurasia increases its integration despite tensions. What's happening more broadly on a historical note is the return of what historians call Afro-Eurasia, the pre-colonial system, the 15th and 16th century world of the maritime and terrestrial Silk Roads, in which Europe, Africa, and Asia were the center of the world economy and also had robust economic linkages with each other. That is the world that is irrevocably returning, and we are only 30 years into it if you think about this post-Cold War era. So final point I want to make is that, again, going back to the sort of central theme, the distribution of wealth and power, well, we are truly in an unprecedented era. Never before has every continent, every region been important simultaneously and had a voice, an autonomous voice, the ability to make their own decisions. Now, they're not equally powerful. The Middle East and South America and Africa are not as powerful as Europe or North America or East Asia, but there is no one power at the center that is stopping anyone from doing business with anyone else. And I think that really is what makes the world such a distributed, global, multi-regional, multi-civilizational marketplace in geopolitics. And I think that is, again, it points to a world in which really great powers, whether it is China or America or Europe, are competing with each other to be the trusted utility providers matters, of whether it's security architecture, infrastructure finance, environmental stewardship, vaccines, whatever the case may be, technology. And this is the competition really that's underway in the world today. And I think that we're going to see, despite this continental drift and despite the slowing of the world economy and the regionalism that is becoming entrenched, there are significant opportunities for capital flows. Countries are less open to migration right now, but certainly open to beneficial technologies and to capital. And so the key lies not in asking whether or not globalization is alive or dead, but rather where are you in the future or emerging patterns of globalization, particularly in the financial space. And I see them being quite vibrant between some of these regions, particularly within Asia and between Europe and Asia, and probably between North America and Asia as well in the years ahead. So with that, I will stop, and thank you so much for having me join you.
Parag, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. Believe me, if you were on the stage today and the audience would be in the auditorium, you'd be getting a standing ovation. Let me just ask you a couple of things based on your address to us today. Parag, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a great concern about living in some of the densely populated areas described, the so-called megacities, which were rising before the virus began to multiply. Now, these are the places where the virus began in China and where it spread very quickly across the US. Do you expect a new type of population distribution pattern post-COVID?
Well, Yuri, you've actually preempted me. That is a slide. If I had added yet more slides, I would have brought that up. It's also the subject of my entire next book, the kind of future of human geography and human demographics in this world of a population plateau and a youth bulge, and concerns over things like climate resilience, sort of being in a green zone for health, looking for places where housing is affordable, where there are jobs. These are all of the motivations. Taking advantage of labor imbalances, right? Moving to aging societies where salaries may be higher in services sectors and so forth. And I believe that we will move from a world of demographic protectionism to a war for talent, especially with aging countries looking for a younger tax base. Now, the pandemic does play a role there in the sense that if you think about which countries have solid medical systems that have held up in the pandemic, think about Japan, Northern Europe, Canada. These countries are also climate resilient. So the question is, will their politics change to absorb some of the young populations that are seeking to live in those societies? More broadly, your question about population density, I would say it depends to some degree. There are countries with large cities that have managed the pandemic decently well, and therefore not necessarily fleeing those cities. Though again, it is happening. You can see population shifts out of, say, Sao Paulo or Rio as people are looking for kind of more airy, less dense, congested sorts of safe havens. But we haven't seen that happen in much larger cities in Asia, for example.
And the social revolution, Parag, which we've seen on the streets of many cities across the world, including New York, Hong Kong, Paris, and which is likely certainly to carry on at least in the next few days in the US when we have this uncertainty over the election result. How will this social revolution change the world of business and investment?
It's a wonderful question, Yuri, and I've been writing about what I call the global underclass revolt, really, since the late 2000s, which of course predates Occupy Wall Street and predates the Arab Spring, because those are the years when I really began to travel around and witness this youth bulge, this listless, unemployed or underemployed youth bulge. And now we've seen that those movements crescendo and snowball. We've seen it in Santiago. We've obviously seen it in Lebanon. We've seen it in Western Europe, as you mentioned. It really only takes a very small spark to trigger significant upheaval and revolt, in the sense that society is rather unjust and unfair. And again, people, the pernicious economic activity of millennials and this Generation Z. The pressure on governance is extremely high. Government to not be wasteful, to be more redistributive as well. And I think that, that we'll see this at the back box. This is driving to some degree ESG movement. We're seeing it in the workplace around the preferences and habits of young employees. So I think it's a pervasive reality at this point. Companies should, of course, govern and regulate themselves in an anticipatory way, expecting that regulations from above are going to nurture this trend and that social pressure from below are going to push in the same direction.
And Parag, I'll ask you lastly, very briefly, you talked about a tripolar world. Where does Russia fit into that today, bearing in mind that a lot of that population movement you talked about was in Eurasia? Do you see Russia pivoting more towards China and being part of an Asian bloc?
Well, Russia is the going concern of geopolitics for the last couple of centuries. The riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, as Churchill said. And I'm very fond of studying Russia, as I have for better part of 25 years. And I have witnessed the tilt towards Asia when President Putin was at President Obama's so-called pivot to Asia in the year 2013, 2014. He said, "We've already pivoted to Asia." And you can witness this in Russia's Eastern Eurasian Economic Forum, which is held every year, and the number of Japanese, Indian, Chinese, Korean, and other firms that are present there and helping to cultivate the food sector, timber, mining, and other areas. You can see that it's a region that, if any region of the world benefits from climate change, again, it's a very terrible and awkward usage of the word benefit, but it is to some degree these parts of Russia. So yes, Russia has tilted towards Asia more, matter-of-factly. Beida University in China maintains an index of countries ranking them by their so-called compliance with China's Belt and Road objectives, and Russia does rank number one as the most compliant country, so to speak. Now, I know for a fact that Russians and the Russian government are very suspicious of China, as every country on earth is. However, the fact that they share a long border and have this enormous power asymmetry means that they will be structurally attached to each other, and that those dynamics are going to evolve rapidly, mostly in China's favor, in terms of what we see now with direct feeding of pipelines from Russia into China. It's something that Russia always refused to do until after the invasion of Ukraine, which led to sanctions, which led to Russia having a weaker negotiating posture, and therefore being, in a way, compelled to build pipelines directly to China. So I do think that Russia is Asianizing demographically, economically, and geopolitically as well.
Well, many thanks indeed, Parag, for that brilliant presentation, which leaves us with a lot of optimism, I think, in these challenging times. And like all the other presentations, that will be available to view on demand. And I'm sure that our conversation between Parag and the Financial Times, I hope will continue, and we look forward to a lot more interaction with you in the future, Parag. Thanks again. And next up, ladies and gentlemen, we have Nikita Iyer, Head of Strategic Business Development and Corporate Strategy at Moxtra, who will frame our forthcoming panel discussion by talking about the digitization of customer experience in wealth management.